Mega podcaster and comedian Joe Rogan conducted a 3-hour-plus long interview with 2024 presidential candidate with the Democrats Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That aired yesterday.
They covered lots of ground, ranging from COVID, vaccines, 2024, and the CIA in regards to the Kennedy legacy. Let's watch some of that.
But what do you think happens when you get into office? Like, if you're talking about your uncle who was assassinated and you believe the intelligence agencies were a part of that, what happens to you?
Well, I got to be careful. I'm aware of that, and I'm not, I'm aware of that danger, and I don't live in fear of it, at all. But I'm not stupid about it, and I take precautions.
I am interested in what kind of precautions he's taking, Jess, because I think if the CIA decides that he is persona non grata, there's only so much you can do.
Someone get your boy a bulletproof helmet. I don't know what else we can do. I know he's out in public. He's posting videos on the campaign trail. He's traveling quite a bit. I mean, if they take him out, will it be before he gets into public office? I'm not quite sure. I think if RFK ends up getting assassinated, it's going to open up a Pandora's box of what's happened with the intelligence community in the United States over the past half a century or more. And so I love when we have members of the Kennedy family giving some insight as to what they believe went down. It seems to be that the consensus generally is JFK, not RFK, but JFK was not a fan at all of how the CIA and covert operations that were done during the Cold War era conducted themselves. He was very critical of it. He didn't like the CIA as a branch of the federal government. And so because of that, it would make sense that he would be a target by the CIA. So I don't think what RFK Jr. said there is some kind of wild conspiracy theory. I think if we look at the pattern of behavior of the CIA and the intelligence community in the United States, it pretty much tracks.
Yeah, I mean, it seems basically universally agreed upon, for the most part, that the official narrative regarding the JFK assassination is obviously not accurate. And that necessarily leads people down the rabbit hole of speculating about CIA involvement. And that's a pretty widely accepted theory at this point. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it might have been called a conspiracy theory, but now people are actually taking that seriously. And I think it's nice to see, as you said, a member of the Kennedy family who's willing to sort of buck the political establishment and speak openly about all of this, and not just regarding the assassination, but also some of the other topics that were covered in the interview, whether it was the pandemic, the vaccine mandates, and he's talked a lot about energy policy as well. It's all just super fascinating. And the fact that he went for 3+ hours on Joe Rogan, I think speaks very highly to his ability to campaign and to talk to people and get his ideas out there, because that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I think I've only ever done one podcast that was longer than an hour, hour and a half, and that's hard work, especially with his voice condition. So I give him a lot of props for doing that.
Yeah, and props to everybody who listened through the whole 3 hours of RFK Jr.'s voice. It's a tough voice to listen to, but he does have some good things to say, which is really what's important here. You can't pick your physical form. And so, yeah, he definitely does have a condition when it comes to that. And it's a difficult thing to run with. Joe Biden knows that very well, the kind of reaction you get in the media. But I think just the fact that he was willing to sit down with Joe Biden and openly speak for 3 hours is something in and of itself. So many times we have these candidates that get in front of a camera, get in front of a crowd, and suddenly they're speaking in platitudes. It's very scripted sounding, sounds like they've rehearsed in the mirror and with a team of consultants. People are getting sick of that. I think people have always been kind of turned off by that. But podcasting, I think, is a good platform. I think instead of a presidential debate, if we got just an hour-long podcast describing your policy platform from each of the candidates, that might be more useful than the very polished questions and responses we get when candidates typically run. So these anti-establishment candidates changing the game, I think is something good in and of itself, even if you don't love RFK Jr. and what he has to say.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like the Trump phenomenon in the 2016 election, which was you had this guy who appeared to be speaking authentically off the cuff. He injected a lot of humor into his rallies. And that was something that people really resonated with. They wanted to hear from somebody who not only was taking their concerns seriously, but was also able to speak about them in a way that was simple and easy to understand and promised to do something about it. It seems like traditionally, presidential campaigns are so overly scripted, they're so boring, and it creates this sort of unattainable sort of hero status for the people who are running. Like they're supposed to be the saviors of our country, and they speak like the founding fathers wrote, hundreds of years ago, and it's a charade that I think has gotten to be quite silly, especially when you do hear people like Trump, like RFK Jr., like Marianne Williamson, being willing to buck that trend and do something different.
And I love that he spoke candidly about topics that are really important. Like he spoke about his uncle's understanding of the military-industrial complex. We have a clip of that. Let's watch.
My uncle, John Kennedy, did that. He refused to go to war. So he was surrounded by military-industrial complex, and he learned very early and an intelligence apparatus that he realized early on that the purpose of the CIA and the intelligence apparatus was to create a constant pipeline of new wars for the military-industrial complex. 3 days before he took the oath of office, Eisenhower, who was the outgoing president, gave what is probably the most important speech in American history, which was, where he warned against the military-industrial complex. I was at my uncle's inauguration. I was in Washington that day. As a 6-year-old boy. And I was sitting on the stands behind him in front of him during his inauguration. And he understood that. And 2 months later, the military and intelligence came to him and said, we got to invade Cuba. And he was like, I'm not going to Cuba, and I'm not going to let the military. And they said, well, we got all these Cubans trained, and they're going to go attack Castro. And he said, well, we can't, the U.S. government can't be doing that. We can't be attacking. I don't like what Castro's doing down there, but it's not the United States' job to dictate what kind of governments other countries have.
That is the real deep state in the United States. The fact that a sitting president could direct the CIA to have operations in the opposite of the direction of what they want to do, and for them to move forward with covert operations to assassinate Castro and what have you. I always was critical of the Reagan administration during the Iran-Contra scandal, when we had Ronald Reagan say he wasn't aware of the arms being sold by way of Iran to the Contras in Nicaragua. But based off of what the CIA operations were in Cuba and what JFK's position was, it does really seem to me that you had the CIA operating kind of independent of our chief executive officer, which is really concerning. And I just appreciate how open RFK Jr. is with all of this.
Yeah, and you see over time that every individual who speaks out against the military-industrial complex and also just the neoconservative approach to foreign policy gets attacked with all sorts of slander, whether it was Trump for being against the Iraq war and wanting to pull troops from Afghanistan, whether it was Tulsi Gabbard for saying that we shouldn't support regime change in Syria because it would lead to all kinds of instability, or whether it was Tucker or other more populist right individuals warning about sending billions of dollars to Ukraine and weapons that we're unable to properly track or account for. I mean, all of these people have been just totally, criticized to the ends of the earth by the establishment because they've dared to speak out about Americans getting involved in more foreign conflict that doesn't have any tangible benefit to their everyday lives.
And I think this is at the heart of our democracy. We don't have candidates running for president talking about foreign policy near as much as we should. And it's at the heart of our democracy to choose who is going to be at the head of the US military, the largest military in the world. That's very important. And so when you have candidates that shy away from talking about really key foreign policy issues, not only that, but it's a threat to our national security, the covert operations that the CIA and intelligence community have executed over the past half of a century. Every other country around the world is acutely aware of those operations. They've had their leaders couped by the CIA. They've had elections overturned by the CIA. They know very well what the United States has been up to abroad, more so than many citizens in the United States, because this is not stuff that we teach. But it is critically important that we pick someone for president that is going to set us on a different path. And I think that it should be a requirement of anyone who cares about the fate of the country and the fate of the world to vote for a president who at least acknowledges that history and wants to go on a different path. I think it would be absurd for anyone to say, well, I still think the United States is like a bastion of freedom and democracy in the world. And whenever we intervene, it's to spread democracy. It's very clear from the pattern of behavior that that's not the case. And I understand it's not something that's taught, and it's not something many people would be aware of. And that's why it's good RFK is bringing it into the conversation for those folks.
Yeah, it's a very arrogant view of foreign policy, and I would only remind the neocons who are obsessed with this idea of nation building that this was not the conception of foreign policy that the founding fathers they so revered had for our country. More rising after this.